Great. So again, thank you so much for having me, Tim. I am excited to be here. This is a topic that working in a government office, we come across very frequently when we're talking about walkability, public space, the urban built environment, and now in the pandemic, really the consequences of what we've done to our space and how that doesn't really mesh with our vision for the future, and what new things we need to start thinking about, and whether the old decision-making processes are going to work in the 21st century when we're trying to address such large issues, climate change, the pandemic. What does that look like when you're talking about a city and about neighborhoods that care about block by block what they are concerned about? And oftentimes that leads to incredible innovation, but I would argue sometimes it is a little backwards looking. Today, just want to talk about sort of the framework of walkability, the historical trends of walkability in public space in New York City, and then get into the design and policymaking processes that I experience on a day-to-day basis, and the post-pandemic challenges, opportunities. And you mentioned Highline. I thought the Highline was a great example to sort of discuss how the grassroots movement sort of took this derelict railroad line, turned it into a park, and how it's sort of being, for lack of a better word, co-opted by larger powers that be, and it becomes less of a community project. And it often is because of its success, is going to be almost a whole new project in the next few years. So this dramatic picture is from me. My bike was stolen last year, and was able to speak to the New York Times about my experience and the lack of bike parking and bike infrastructure in the city. So I am a biking advocate and urbanist, but my day job is I'm the chief of staff for a state senator that represents much of Midtown Manhattan, West Village, up to the Upper West Side, Stuytown, East Village. And I moved here about 10 years ago to get my degree in politics from NYU, and then got my master's in public administration in 2018. So I'm also an avid cat and plant dad. And so just a little bit about me, and some of the qualifications about why I feel very comfortable talking about this topic. So I would just like to take a moment for everyone to think about spaces that they enjoy, spaces that they feel like they can walk around, that they feel comfortable in. And if there are any volunteers that want to say where those spaces are, what sort of elements you can sort of pick out from those spaces that make it memorable and important to you. Okay, this is a difficult thing to do while sharing my screen. Okay, I see Talia.
Hi. Well, this is going to be different from what I did for my mural board, but this inspired me, this picture, because I love the city, but also Greenwich, the main street, a lot of the places are dog friendly there. And that's why I love going there, because not only is the street have a lot of places for like dogs to sit down, but also the stores, even though they're not technically public space, are very dog friendly. And that's just a big thing for me because I can bring my dog.
Yeah, that is an important element, bringing friends around and bringing our furry friends around. And I don't see Alana.
Yeah, so this was the one that I looked at this weekend, so I'll talk about more in the afternoon. But I think the Brooklyn Bridge Park is a really amazing space, and partly because it's such a versatile space. You have everything from like sort of like touristy, scenic places to dine and like take pictures to places for like basketball and soccer and volleyball. Um, and I think like if you look at what the space used to be, just like a very industrial sort of abandoned piers, what they've done with it is really amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. The versatility of activities in Brooklyn Bridge Park is really an example that the Hudson River Park pulls from, that other large parks use as an example. So that is an incredible space. Jake?
Yeah, so I was lucky enough to live right by the Louvre this year in Paris. So Rue Rivoli is a road, and basically now it has no cars. There's only one car lane. But that area around it, there's palaces and like gardens that I absolutely love. So that's my favorite place.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to a good post-pandemic example of reallocating space for people rather than cars, and what that means. And Mariah.
So this is also different from the one that I decided to pick for my mural board, but Barnes and Noble, oddly enough, like I just like to go there and spend time there. I go there by myself, I go there with friends, I'll go there to look at new books, to do homework, to work on my artwork. It's just like a very like comfortable and quiet space. And if I like want to walk around and like look at anything to like give me like inspiration or ideas, I can do that too, which I really like.
Yeah, love it. And Maria.
If we're thinking walkability, I really think like the High Line works well, or like Chelsea Piers, or somewhere where there you don't have to brake a lot for cars or a lot of commotion. Like I feel like you flow more in a way when you walk somewhere where you aren't interrupted, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's a separation of those uses. The cars are beneath you. You get to walk. You're not even competing with bicycles on the High Line. So it's very, very specific. And I think that's a great example. Yeah, I, having gone to NYU, really love Soho. I love the energy of the streets. I love the cobblestones. I love the architecture. It feels small, but you're still in the heart of the city. So this is the picture that I chose because I could just walk around the heart of Soho all day. So when we talk about these things, these elements, we're really talking about not just the space, but the activities and the things that link to that space. So this was a quote from the Project for Public Spaces. The factors affecting people's decision to walk are the types of factors that make a good place: uses and activities, access and linkages, comfort and image, and sociability. And so when I sort of approach a project in government, and what we are looking towards, I think not just to address the pandemic, but new modes of transportation, things that sort of go back in time a little bit to capture the good things about the late 20th century of walking and biking and other modes of transportation, but also creating interesting spaces that, you can imagine that there are sidewalks in suburbs, but aren't heavily used because there's no point in getting from point A to point B, just simply because a sidewalk exists, but making it purposeful. In a city like ours, it's important that it be accessible to everyone, and that that accessibility intersects with all classes of mobility, all economic classes and race. Many of the touristy places that we would think of as being particularly walkable or welcoming, are in very wealthy neighborhoods in Manhattan. So there's still a lot of work to be done about making that accessible in places outside of the central business district in Manhattan. Integration with public transportation and prioritizing people over cars. I think there's been a movement recently to reallocate space more equitably in a more logical way that fits with how people are moving and not benefiting people simply for car ownership, which in itself is a barrier to transportation. The cost of getting a car, insuring it, and upkeep is a cost that an individual takes on when many other modes of transportation sort of share that cost amongst the public. Bringing nature to urban settings. That third picture from the left is from Barcelona. Great examples of turning super blocks into oases that don't feel like cities. They're busy like cities, but add an element of nature and connection to less urban elements. And then again, mixing street uses. It's not just a space to walk alongside cars, but now with open restaurants, we're bringing some of that activity out onto the street. It's making it more interesting to walk along the street, and some of those elements, you'll see later on in the presentation, are beneficial for the overall walkability of the city, but they sometimes compete with the accessibility. Sidewalks are blocked for those in wheelchairs, and also the neighborhoods that these open restaurants are in are populated by people that live right above them and experience the effects of a restaurant being open until 2 a.m. So that is often something that our office deals with on an ongoing basis. And so I just kind of want to talk about the history briefly of how we got to where we are before we sort of look ahead. Some of the first parks in New York were developed in 1686. They weren't really parks. It was just considered unallocated space that the city sort of took over to turn into greens. Long history of European countries protecting large swaths of land in the middle of their cities to create public spaces. So New York sort of experienced that first wave in 1686. The city then purchased Duane Park, which is in Tribeca, in 1797 for $5 and turned it into an actual sitting park rather than what you would consider a green or a market, but more for leisure. And then we sort of get into New York growing in ways that are controlled, constrained, and all in the background, we're still sort of, the mode of transportation is walking, is horse-drawn carriages, is pull carts, but John Randall's grid plan for Manhattan up through the island sort of sets the stage for a whole new idea of what traffic and public space looks like. Before, I mean, if you can imagine, much of Manhattan was farmland and broken up into parcels. So the idea of instilling a grid onto the streets sort of sets the stage for that transformation. 1883, the Brooklyn Bridge is completed. We have this here is Brooklyn Heights, Cadman Plaza, as it used to be, the elevated train rail that and depot that would go over the Brooklyn Bridge, and just sort of demonstrates that there's still a heavy reliance on elevated rail, push carts, walking, and cars really haven't begun to make their mark on the city. Again, 1911, this is a picture of the Flatiron Building. And to note, this is not to romanticize the period of time that the city was sort of growing exponentially without cars. There was a great deal of safety concerns. The mixing of horses and pedestrians was also very unsafe. And so there was a lot of room for growth. But as we get into the 1920s, there's a rise of car-centric infrastructure, and that is 1927. The Holland Tunnel is built, destroying one of the larger parks in Lower Manhattan for on-ramps into the tunnel. And that picture at the top is Park Avenue before lanes were added on either side, sort of destroying the median and the name of it being Park Avenue, where it actually doesn't turn into a park, but a thoroughfare for car traffic. And so this is what that Flatiron district looks like now. And you can see just how much space we've chosen to allocate for car travel. The bike lane was a recent addition, and that public plaza to the left was actually a recent addition as well in the last 10, 15 years, sort of reclaiming these underutilized spaces. During the Bloomberg administration, Jeanette Sadiq Khan was a huge proponent of sort of putting down paint, putting up barriers, and creating these public spaces that made Fifth Avenue and Broadway on 23rd Street a crazy intersection into an actual livable, walkable space. And then continuing the timeline, we can't help but talk about Robert Moses, who becomes the Parks Commissioner in 1934 and the construction coordinator in 1946. That's Lincoln Center. He demolished blocks of row houses in order to build this cultural institution. I think there is a debate and something that we'll get into in a moment, but the power from above, the decision to build these spaces from the top down is inherently a very blunt object. And that decision-making is still very fraught to this day. And there are still some other examples that I'd be more than happy to share. And then continuing, 1950 overnight street parking is legalized in New York City. Took almost 50 years for that to happen, and it's a relatively new phenomenon. And then I'll introduce you to Jane Jacobs, who was a West Village resident and led the effort to stop the Lower Manhattan Expressway that would have run through Washington Square Park, and sort of continue this cycle of car infrastructure and continue that top-down approach that Robert Moses sort of embodies to this day. And then 1975, New York City experiences a financial crisis that sort of flips the relationship between the state, federal government, and the city on its head. New York City had an incredible social safety net. They provided free healthcare clinics. CUNY was free to all New York City residents. And because of the financial crisis, many of those things slowly disappeared and required grassroots activism to either save what they could, salvage what they could, and it really is a good example of this top-down, what it means to make a top-down decision and the effects of it being felt across multiple sectors without really listening to the community and the effects that it could potentially have. And so this is where we end up with design and policymaking in the current setting. So some background here. Some of our biggest actors that we work with are community boards, like Tim alluded to. So our district covers community boards 2 through 7, and they are made up of residents or business leaders within those certain districts. They officially have an advisory role for just about anything that goes on within the district, but they have a formal role in the uniform land use review process, which is important for mostly building and zoning. So a little bit less about public space, but they definitely have opinions on that as well. And also we're in a place where the demands of certain modes of transportation are beginning to change. People were afraid to take the subway during the pandemic. We're seeing a rise in biking, and open streets, open restaurants are becoming destinations that are accessible by foot or by bike. And it's interesting to see that play out. Again, the financial health of the city and the state. What does it look like when we have ideas on how we can better design cities and public spaces, but the money just isn't there, or we have to look for capital partners for these projects, or where does the line between city and state responsibility really fall? I think it's interesting from our perspective. We are a state elected official's office, but because we measure our district in blocks rather than acres like some of our colleagues upstate, we still care deeply about the minute changes in our neighborhood. Is the trash can overflowing on the corner of 26th and 8th Avenue? Is the busway on 14th Street actually doing its job, and what's the data for that? So what would normally be a rather local decision involves many, many players in a place like New York City. And then the structures of political institutions are critical. We look back before 1975, the Robert Moses era, during the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and the makeup of government was very, very different. The Board of Estimate was what originally existed before the city council. Borough presidents had almost a veto power on local projects that were taking place in their boroughs, which really allowed a handful of people to consolidate power in a way that in some ways would be very difficult to do today. The decision-making process has been decentralized, relying on these community boards, relying on community actors to inform the decision-making process in a way that wasn't occurring when Robert Moses was building the Cross Bronx Expressway or any parkway on Long Island that destroyed buildings. That's not to say that power dynamic still doesn't exist, but it still is a very different dynamic than what it was in the first half of the 20th century. And then design and this area of intersection feels like a very natural area of compromise for those at the top and those community grassroots members that often have tension with what they're trying to achieve. I take bike lanes, for example. The Department of Transportation would love to create a network of connected bike lanes, but the community board are informed about future projects that the Department of Transportation does, often have many thoughts, block by block, about how that won't work or how it could be changed to better accommodate other uses, car parking or pedestrians. So when we get into the details of activating space through design, it often is the case that those elements on the fringes are what get chopped or get added versus the overall decision of whether to do the project or not. And that, I think, leads to a natural tension that between policymaking and design that I'm sure you are exploring in much greater depth. So sort of to reiterate these power dynamics, on one end, we have these grassroots bottom-up approaches, Jane Jacobs being sort of the end-all be-all. Individual power, even though in mass is important, can still be very, very low. Project scale often is very small, talking block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, and change can occur very, very slowly. It took many, many decades for the West Village to become what it is today. It took 5, 6, 7 years for a busway on 14th Street to occur. So they often are the ones that the grassroots element that seek consensus, seek compromise, which can feed into an insular, don't want to say bubble, but the idea is very similar to a NIMBYism, especially in richer, wider neighborhoods. And then we have Robert Moses with the top-down approach. Individuals have a lot of say over what can be done. The project scales are enormous, and change can occur incredibly quickly and speed up the timelines for those design elements. And like I said, the tools with a top-down approach just aren't inherently blunt. They require tearing down buildings. They require usurping zoning or the community input process. They build massive things, but that could also mean destroying a lot of things that the community loves and would like to see stick around. So sort of to quantify in some ways, grassroots, we see some projects like community gardens or more organic street uses, the life and death of the American city that Jane Jacobs wrote. Very idyllic streets, kids playing in the streets. The butcher across the street knows what key is yours and holds onto it just in case you get locked out, is watching the park across the street so there isn't any trouble. And you see this on a very small scale, but feels organic and feels like there's buy-in from a large group of people. And right now we're working with community boards and a decentralized planning process that leads to sort of a hodgepodge of different elements that you would expect to be more systematic, like bike lanes, like the public plaza space, like parks. They're often taken care of at a very local level. And again, with Robert Moses, highways, bridges, public transportation. It took billions of dollars, but almost one man to build the Triborough Bridge, which revolutionized the connection between the Bronx, Manhattan, and Queens, but was one of the largest undertakings at the time. And to this day, these projects still exist, but in a slightly different fashion. So the East Side Access has been an idea for 10 years and was finally put into, was begun a few years ago and is now reaching its completion. It required a massive collaboration between the federal government and the state and city. Really, that wouldn't have been accomplished without all of the players sort of coming together and those power brokers agreeing to this project. So even if the Long Island community that would have loved an East Side Access tunnel, you could guess that even if they had the power, the ability to organize, that it would still require some sort of institutional buy-in from a Robert Moses-like person to get accomplished. And just the other interesting project on my docket right now, the Empire Station Complex. The governor announced in his State of the State this year that he was going to build 10 towers around the current Penn Station, which would help fund projects for renovation of the train station and also connection to the new Hudson Tunnel that would duplicate the tunnel access into New York City. So there were so many moving parts that something like Robert Moses, like Governor Cuomo, were essential to seeing these projects move forward. And to break down some of these current actors that we work with on a daily basis, we have these unofficial and local organizations, block associations, community organizations that have an affinity for a particular project. They often are the loudest people in the room, but may not represent the majority opinion of the community, but they are the ones that show up, and showing up at a community meeting is honestly 90% of the deal. We have these official local groups like community boards, city council members, borough presidents, business improvement districts like the Meatpacking or the Flatiron District that have institutional support, that have a means of gathering funding, and are part of the superstructure of government and its administration. They have a designation to do that job and follow through with that in a formal way. And then we have the unofficial and citywide nonprofits, advocacy organizations, thinking like business groups or other the Sunrise Movement, other advocacy organizations that may not be concerned about particular projects, but are pushing a particular agenda in how that project needs to fit in with their ideals. Climate change being an important one, labor unions being another that we come across when buildings are being fought against by neighbors. A developer wants to put in a tower. It would provide jobs for labor unions, and they often end up siding with the developer in support of these larger projects for financial reasons. And then official and citywide, we have these larger agencies. The mayor can have an agenda and have a desire to push through projects. The Department of City Planning, the Commission, Parks and DOT, they in some ways act as a top-down leader in some of these ways. They have problem areas that they're aware of, intersections that they want to take care of. They go to community boards and present their design ideas, and the community board can give feedback, but it is a less organic way for some of these projects to come about, but do allow for potentially additional resources to make it happen. So I thought I'd walk through just what I experience on a daily basis. We get tons of emails about what better ways we can build our city, what better ways we can improve transportation or institute a certain policy that would improve people's lives. So for example, you have an idea. You want to activate a particular public plaza. Right now is being used for car parking. And you think, you know what, that parking isn't necessary, but it would be lovely to have some tables, chairs, umbrellas. There's a coffee shop across the street. It would be great for them to have a place to sit. So you tweet out, hey, do you take a picture? This would be great. You tag the Department of Transportation and they say, okay, thank you, but we'd love for you to submit your request online. The online form is about 10 pages. It requires you to go through 3 or 4 drop-down menus, and then gives you a box to sort of describe what you would like to see. It takes a while for that request to make it through their inbox. So about a month later, you hear back from the DOT saying why your idea really isn't feasible and why we're just going to have to scrap the idea. You reach out to an office like mine, and you tell them that you'd love for this project to happen. We follow up with DOT. We potentially write a letter to our contacts in the agency, but a few weeks later, they tell us, no, that's not going to happen. You finally decide to show up to a full board meeting for your local community board where the public plaza it should be. These meetings take place once a month, are long, and the public comment session often doesn't start until 2 hours after the start of the meeting. So you're there 8:30 at night trying to advocate for this public plaza idea. After you speak, the chair recommends you actually raise the item with their transportation committee, which is going to occur a month later. So you reach out to the chair of the committee and ask for that item to be on their agenda. That could be a hit or a miss, but the committee members that we work with are very open to new ideas. So would encourage you to do that. And you go and attend the transportation committee meeting. You bring a few friends who will also speak on the topic. And during their business session, they agree to draft a resolution in support of your idea to turn the public plaza or the parking spot in public parking lot into a public plaza. That resolution then gets voted on by the committee, then gets voted on by the full board, which then occurs the following month, which is then sent to the Department of Transportation and becomes the official position of the community board. Now DOT can't just blow off this idea as being some strange individual who has a great idea, but you've now built a coalition with the community board, and DOT now has to respond. They would love to implement your suggestion, but the capital budget just won't allow for it this year. So instead, they use temporary cost-effective measures, the sand paint, the bollards, the granite blocks to sort of block off the space. But those tables, chairs, umbrellas, that's not DOT's responsibility, and they would need to find a capital project partner to maintain the plaza and bring those tables and chairs in and out of that plaza. So without a capital partner in sight, DOT doesn't feel the need to complete the project this season or this quickly, so they wait until their implementation season the following spring when the weather starts getting a little bit nicer. So as you can see, this process from idea to implementation sort of takes different routes, different avenues, and is frankly an uphill battle, especially when we know that there are so many ideas and so many good design ideas that the city needs. And part of the issue is this bureaucracy that we need to go through in order to achieve what should be a universal good. Now, we look at a top-down approach. Governor Cuomo has an idea. For example, he lays it out during his State of the State address, like the Empire Station Complex, like the update to LaGuardia Airport. That gets incorporated into the appropriations budget during budget season, which ends April 1st. So March really is a rush to get things done. That money is ultimately allocated, and through a quasi-government organization known as the Empire State Development Corporation, they use those funds to develop a general plan that can override local zoning regulation and does not need to go through a community board process or other required community input. ESD completes the state environmental quality review process. Again, without much community input, they'll do some studies, but often lead to the conclusion that, yes, this massive project is good and important. And from there, if it doesn't require a federal partner, the state can immediately begin action on that project. So we see the imbalance between resources and power, and just what that means to be able to cut through bureaucracy and implementing design. So that doesn't necessarily mean that the design that Governor Cuomo comes up with is the most ideal situation. For example, the AirTrain to the new LaGuardia terminals requires Manhattan residents to actually go farther past LaGuardia to hit a AirTrain station to then get to LaGuardia. So activists, community members are a little confused about why that project plan was selected, but because there was no community input, the governor was able to move forward with that project. And so what we see is that it's easier, but still is contentious and may not necessarily be the most welcome to the community. Also importantly, large-scale projects are going to be critical. There are things like the BQE, like the Hudson Tunnel, like the Empire Station Complex that do in fact need to be renovated, that do need the resources, that do need that political muscle to move. But because it is such a blunt tool to go top down, you end up with a very difficult situation of trying to accommodate community members while also not foregoing the resources and power that are necessary to get something large scale done. And then, like I mentioned, neighborhoods like the West Village, like the Upper West Side, that are wider and wealthier tend to have the ability to sort of flip this calculation on its head. They're not as grassroots. They have the connections to politicians, to leaders that allow them to sort of maintain the status quo, and changing that status quo becomes more difficult in places that have the resources to fight it. So with all this being said, we're in a new era of how we're thinking about what we want from our cities, what we want from our streets, what we want from our government. And so there are a number of challenges and opportunities that we're thinking about. And it's unfortunate because because some of these ideas are so large, as an individual office, as an individual working within a government office, they may inform some of the things I do on a day-to-day basis, but they're huge, they're enormous. They're not something that I, as an individual or even as an elected official, can take on, but maybe inform our day-to-day activities with the understanding that we're trying to achieve a much larger goal, like fighting climate change, which we're not going to do by simply implementing one busway or one park. And so that's sort of the scale difference that we have to keep in mind. Is the future Jane Jacobs or Robert Moses? In short, I think it's both. You still need those large scale projects. You still need the resources that come with state, federal, local monies. But you also need those grassroots ideas. You need communities to be engaged. You need the political body to sort of understand the larger undertaking that we're trying to achieve. And that is a slow process of getting people on board, of showing up to meetings, community board meetings, of working with constituents, hearing constituents out. And they have plenty of avenues in which to provide their input through these official local organizations like community boards, through elected officials like the state senator. But there still is a disconnect between grassroots and top-down approaches. And it really is the resources, the power, and the bureaucracy that sort of exists for communities and individuals that doesn't quite exist for governors or executives. And so some of these ideas that we get into now, post-pandemic, the 6-foot city, NACDO has provided some guidance on implementation for reallocating public spaces that have been used for cars, for private enterprise, for other public uses that now need to come outside rather than stay indoors where it's less safe and transmission can increase. So outdoor dining, slow streets, play streets, voting streets, moving voting machines out onto the street, which is a fascinating concept that everything can be a public plaza, everything can be activated in a new way, that now that we've sort of hit this crisis of an opportunity to accommodate the pandemic or even future pandemics or other public health crises. And then a little trite, but the 15-minute city of within walking distance, within biking, what's accessible to you? What can you get in your neighborhood? It's interesting that we're sort of looking back to what existed in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and every neighborhood had its grocery store, its cobbler, its every industry you could think of was within walking distance or biking distance of your home. And now we're sort of returning to this idea that you need that repetition of services in neighborhoods across boroughs, across the city, in order for people to think about other modes of transportation that are less intensive for the environment. People aren't going to jump in their car and drive 15 minutes to the grocery store if there's an affordable, good grocery store around the corner. And that really is in the back of our minds as we start thinking about uses, mixed uses, and how this divide between residential, commercial, and industrial uses within our zoning needs to be a little more fluid, a little more flexible to accommodate these needs, these future needs. And then another top-down approach, recently the city council just approved a streets master plan. In the entire history of New York City, there has never been a centralized planning process for our streets. So that's part of the reason why a bike lane ends at 30th Street and 7th Avenue and doesn't keep going. You're just sort of thrown into traffic because There was somebody on a community board that probably allocated for that bike lane to stop there to protect biking. There's a stretch of commercial spaces there. So the thought right now from a lot of business leaders is that you need parking for people to come and frequent your business, which isn't necessarily true in a dense urban environment. And you can when people can walk, take a bike or take a subway. But that's one of the reasons why that bike lane probably ends there. But with a streets master plan, we get to think more holistically. It becomes less about what burden are we placing on a particular neighborhood, a particular community, and more about how all of the pieces need to fit together in a cohesive way that makes sense. And the attempt by the city council is to make it a grassroots process, but a lot of the technical, larger network issues are going to be done in a top-down, probably agency-wide down process that creates some natural tension with some of the communities that we work with. So what about grassroots design? Many of the open shared streets are run by local advocates, by people who wake up to put up the barriers in the morning, and also suggest additional streets to be closed to car traffic or open to restaurants. Other organic means of using the street and our sidewalk and our public spaces sort of come from these individuals that have ideas. And I love the idea of these guerrilla activists in these neighborhoods who close down their streets or create their own little parklets in spaces that are designated for cars, and using and building out community space, green space that is for everyone and not for a personal use. And then we also see some local partnerships with the official and local institutions, and sort of a recent reimagining of the public realm and breaking down bureaucracy, how we're thinking about street corners and what we need as people in living in a city now that we're in a pandemic, now that we sort of want to change the calculus of how we think about our street space. So I think there are plenty of opportunities for some grassroots designers to take a lead there. And just briefly to discuss the High Line, as most of you probably know, it's a elevated rail line that snakes from Gansevoort to 34th Street and is a natural garden with many natural plants and sort of cuts through this dense residential area. The line was constructed in 1934, and in 1983 there was a resident who formed a foundation to sort of get this going. So it created a local focal point in which to move some of those energies. And so thinking back to that grassroots framework. But as we start seeing it stalls out. There's nothing done with this idea for 15 years and needs additional buy-in from institutions like the mayor, like the Giuliani administration, specifically the Bloomberg administration and the city council, and the resources that they can provide to build out something like the High Line. And it continues to expand, and there's now a robust organization that oversees it, but relies very heavily on private donors and some government funds in order to operate. But you can see that even this grassroots approach to something really needed that institutional support in order to become possible. And so where we're at now, it is a critical corridor for walkability, for open public space, but it closes at a certain time, similar to Little Island off of Hudson River Park. This is supposed to be a public space, but what does it mean when an organization can shut down the High Line at a certain hour or institute rules to maintain the park? And that is another natural tension with community members that feel like it's their backyard, that's their park. And its use as a tourist hotspot is, I think, important for its financial success, but what does that mean for the community and its uses? And recently, Governor Cuomo announced a proposal to connect the High Line to the recently built Moynihan Train Hall. And from this, you can see off of the spur above 10th Avenue, they're going to create an above ground connection to what is a private building, current hotel that has its own walkway that will then connect to Moynihan Train Hall. So getting even further into this idea, it's a public space, it's a public asset, but it's now sort of being treated as a private walkway. It's an important walkway corridor, but in order for it to expand, we're now getting the state involved in a way that I don't think when the person set up the foundation in 1983, they would have anticipated ever happening. And here's one of the designs. It's fascinating that we would, it's great to separate the pedestrians from the traffic below, but it's a fascinating idea that we built these above ground railways. They were defunct and we turned them into a park, but now we're sort of continuing this trend of building parks above ground, these linear parks, in order to separate uses and use it more as a source of transportation, as a means of transportation, rather than a leisure asset. It's not a park, but a walkway to get to the train hall to catch your train, which, you know, we're still grappling with, and we don't know what the answers are. But I'm interested to see just what that could potentially look like. Reclaiming some of that space. But again, who's using that walkway to Moynihan Train Hall, who's coming off of the High Line to experience that space. And that we still need a lot more answers to. And finally, again, we see this need for funding sources, these right-of-way agreements, and the asset management. These plans came together extremely quickly after the State of the State address and are almost finalized. That process would take a year at minimum in order to complete if it weren't spurred on by the governor's office. And we still don't know where these mock-ups, these designs came from. They, I believe, came from the governor's office. Without community input. So what does that look like? What is that when the rubber hits the road and it's getting built and the community board and the local neighborhood needs to weigh in? With zero buy-in from these designs, how does that conversation go? What does that look like at these meetings? And again, like I said at the top, the question now isn't necessarily whether the project continues or not, but how does the project change in order to fit the needs of the community based off of their input? And there's still outstanding questions about how it improves walkability and its use of walkability in that context as being a connector to a train hall. So that was my brief case study and presentation.
Thank you Thank you. So you packed in so much. I have a couple of questions to start off, and I want to sort of pass it over to the students, who I'm sure have some questions too. One of the things that is interesting about this process of designing, what is a future use of a space in the process. And it was wonderful how you went through I think a lot of people don't understand the complexity of how that step-by-step process works, and how it kind of gets unwound and then sort of like corrupted towards things that should happen that don't happen. Is that when we think about speculative futures for space, is that also looking at speculative pasts? And one of the things related to the High Line is the point at which Bloomberg commissioned the study on, New York City as a luxury product. And that, so when we think about where the High Line is going, and you're talking about this pathway and so forth, is that, to go to a public comment process, informing people so they understand, it's always a matter of understanding what built up to that point. In a simpler way, it would be like, in a neighborhood, knowing, why do I care if we lose the flower district or the garment district, because I just moved here 10 years, I don't know what that is. And then you kind of don't know what you don't have until it's not there anymore. And you realize how interconnected it was. This issue of tourism driving a lot of these public works, these public space projects, is that I don't think there's a better way of focusing on that, and figuring out how to sort of get people involved in kind of as citizens in that process a bit. I wanted to know what your thoughts were on that at all.
Yeah, I think that speaks to the motivation of those leaders at the top trying to push down a design, right? If everything is marketable, if everything needs some sort of value, then that's really going to be the driving motivation of those folks. Whereas I think the motivation for many of the community, and to your point, a lot of folks stay in Chelsea Hell's Kitchen and have been there for 40, 50 years and know what it was like to watch some of their neighborhood be demolished or get torn down. And they internalize that history and they bring it into every fight that we enter into. And sometimes it feels a bit off topic, but it also doesn't mean that the person, the governor or the mayor pushing a design downward are right in their approach as well. And so it's a very difficult, nuanced conversation to have, especially when I think we're still in a mode where government doesn't do anything, government doesn't produce what we want. So we're just happy when something happens. And I think that's the mentality of a lot of leaders. It's like, well, isn't it great that we're just building a park? But there are a lot of other moving pieces that require input from people that aren't in the room when the decision is made. And it's hard, and it's an ongoing iterative process for almost everything that we do.
It's not always the other thing that, for my brief time sort of being involved in the community board around the St. Vincent's project, is that it's not always as it appears. And I'll give you an anecdote that I'm sort of curious if you have any thought on this, is that, there's the developer who immediately is evil. However, there's also the issue of the fact that the hospital was bankrupt and so forth. But then on the other side, there's a wonderful organization, a grassroots organization run by Andrew Berman called, Greenwich Village Historic Preservation. But one of the things I learned through that process that I was kind of surprised is that I realized that Andrew Berman and that organization likes certain historic buildings and they don't like others. So they have their own kind of aesthetic. It was towards the Maritime. They were happy with letting the Maritime building go, but the other ones that were older sort of fit their particular idea of what should be kept. And you start realizing is that everybody has kind of an ideological stake in it. part of policy, I mean, I want to sort of get you to sort of make a point about this, is that you know, it's a lot of the ways in which we get lost through that rhetoric in that process. And if I felt as though during a lot of that is people kind of were sort of corrupted by, and they sort of took camps, is that they could stay open to kind of really knowing kind of the complexity of the issue. Is there any sort of like, you know, any thoughts on that particular issue at all?
Yeah, I mean, something that I have been saying for almost all of these projects and my experience here in this office is everything is political. Everyone has an agenda, and that's not to say that it is bad or evil, but everyone has an idea of what they want to see, and that gets represented in a multitude of ways. And you know, Andrew choosing what projects to care about or not to care about, or even our office and the things that we choose to fight for, not fight for. It's impossible to remove that from these discussions. And so when we talk about these designs more broadly, that just always needs to be in the back of your head, is that someone's coming to the table with an idea of what they want, and the motivations aren't necessarily bad, but can be antithetical to quote unquote progress. And speaking about even larger ideas like fighting climate change, like building a more accessible city, like these things are very ethereal and very unconcrete to many people's minds. And my recommendation is to always say, okay, what does this look like on paper when the rubber hits the road, and what are we actually trying to achieve in a larger sense? And part of it too is the way that the political structures are broken down in New York City. Community boards have a very strong sway on the work that we do, but they create clear boundaries in the spaces that they care about, which means that large networks that would be important for the function of our city receive scrutiny from 6-7 different boards. And that is a bureaucratic nightmare for someone from DOT trying to like build a 3-foot bike lane. And it really all is political when it all comes down to it.
I think that, you know, I think that you really hit the nail there with this idea of how it's very abstract and it's very difficult for average people, you know, when you come into sort of, you know, if you attend one of those community board meetings and, you know, you have to sit there for 2 hours before you even, and it's very, the stuff that's being described is very abstract. One of the things that sort of interests me a lot is how to make it less abstract. So some of these issues like climate change and mobility within cities, we look at the fact that our population is aging and we're living longer. We don't want to be put in nursing homes. Why can't I stay living, aging in place in my community? That's a design issue. That's a design and policy issue. When you talk about 15-minute cities, it's like, if we designed things to work that way, I'd never have to leave. You have to leave because the city no longer assists you. So you have to go to another facility for them to assist you to live, right? So there's part of that is a very concrete kind of thing where we said, like, God, nobody wants to go into a nursing home. So maybe we need to design our stuff. When we start talking about climate change in an abstract way, or even if you're in your 80s and somebody's talking about bike lanes, they're kind of like, I don't ride a bike. I don't give a crap about that. But that's so part of, if you build bike lanes, it's tied to other things. It's getting to people to make those connections that's tough, you know?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, everyone brings their personal perspective, their experience, where they are in their life. NORCs are, I think, are very underutilized tool for especially our aging population in New York City, and making it accessible for everyone. But there just is not. Everyone says we love a NORC, but how do we get to a place where we're building communities that can function that way. And it is difficult to make some of these things, especially if your point is not necessarily like you said, an 80-year-old's not going to ride a bike, but man, like if we had more bike lanes, it would be important for how people move about the city, and and so.
Well, the history, I just interject, the history of bike lanes, like if you go to certain cities, and I spent a lot of time, is that when like Portland is a case study, when you start caring about that, you start caring about other things that have nothing to do with bikes, that just have to do with accessibility. I mean, like Delft, Holland, Copenhagen, other things, it just changes, it rewires the brain. But it's hard to get people to understand that, but policy can help to understand that, I think.
Yeah, totally. And making that personal connection. And this is the hard work of elected officials and governments, is that you have to convince a lot of folks, individual, conversation by conversation, why you should care about something that you don't feel is necessarily going to be used by you or is going to be important to you. But I think that's the beauty of living in a dense urban city, is that it all affects us. It really just is important for everyone to have a stake in. But yeah, makes my job a bit difficult.
Does anybody have, we could take some questions from students. Just jump right in. Or comment.
I have like a, I have like a fairly specific question. But one of the things I've thought about a lot recently is what like the future of outdoor dining will look like. And the question of like, how does like a public space like the road essentially become a private space? And I'm just wondering, like, what are the different forces or factors at play for the city? Like, in other words, what are the pros and cons of them keeping or sort of abandoning the outdoor seating?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we're sort of in a figure out phase right now. The open restaurant program was an emergency program with very little oversight, with very little enforcement. So we're now sort of entering a phase where the city wants to formalize it in zoning text and keep it permanent, where I imagine that process would be a little more rigorous than just throwing up, a few pieces of plywood. But part of your point, the privatization of this public space is a real concern for a lot of the neighbors that I speak to, in that maybe it's a higher use than a parked car, but right now restaurants get to use the space for free. So I think part of the upcoming iteration of open streets will require some sort of fee, some sort of payment for that use, and some sort of oversight process by community boards. Community boards were essential for approving outdoor dining spaces before the pandemic, and sidewalk cafes. So I imagine that those similar oversight processes will be a part of a more permanent open restaurant system.
Something came up related to that was that I was sort of curious if there's any doing kind of a study on the disconnect, because it became kind of a design hack, but it also ended up sort of putting a lot of pressure on these restaurant owners to meet certain design criteria, and they would end up getting fined during that process. And so in a way, a lot of restaurants ended up complaining because it became an economic burden. They'd come, they built this thing, they were just trying to make up for all the money they were losing, but then somebody from the city would come around and say, well, you're not doing it right, you're an inch over into the streets and whatever. Is there anything in terms of improving policy by looking back at what happened there and making sure some of those things don't happen?
Yeah, for sure. And even to that point, the sidewalk cafes are taking up sidewalk space, making it difficult for people to move around. On one street in Soho, there are open restaurants on both sides, which if a fire truck drove down would make it impossible for them to open up their doors. These things, it's happening in such great numbers that the enforcement of some of these original ideas that were supposed to be laid out during this emergency program sort of get lost, or and then the enforcement is very wishy-washy. So you don't know when someone's going to come by and say this is an inch too far, or you might get somebody, we've heard plenty of times where they come by and say, nah, whatever. It's like, you're doing what you're doing. It's like, okay. So that level of consistency and putting that process in place is going to be interesting when we think about government administration and managing a city. I think there are many, many different areas right now where the city has sort of had to cobble together what they would like to see enforcement wise or administration wise. And if we're going to continue in this phase of needing to still eat outside, this pandemic is not going to go away quickly. There will have to be real conversations about administration and its efficiency.
I think that, something else that came to mind during that process to me was we don't have designers really working, in the city. And the sad fact is there need to be probably new jobs inside government that is able to imagine and be able to mediate between what is the space and the people who occupy, own it and use it, whatever, and then policymakers. Because what it is, it's a very kind of like, it's a sort of like a hammer for everything. You just kind of go bang, bang, and then send somebody, you did it wrong, bang, bang. And the bike lane process is another example of that. It's broken. It's not like, bike lanes are useless unless they go everywhere and you could use them as a system. They're a transportation system, but we're not kind of, in a way, designers could help people understand the use. And some of those issues you talked about, owners saying, well, I'm going to lose business and so forth. That's a design opportunity. Any conversations about hiring more designers within government? Because that seems to be something I would think that would be needed.
No, I would absolutely love to see more designers. We work closely with DOT and they have their set of designers, but it honestly takes, I believe, a dozen agencies to manage the public realm in any particular street corner. So there is a dearth of designers in consumer affairs and the Department of Health and Human Hygiene, right? So to your point, there needs to be some of that thought going into the work that they're doing.
Yeah, like even more of like an oversight role, because I can think of an example of, the DOT and what is it, the Port Authority, they all have designers and architects, but I can think of a project right in my neighborhood, which is a substation, which was the inspiration for the great Nighthawks painting. And it's the most horrible, everybody it's just horrible. It's where the Triangle Park, it's where the tiles are put and everything, but no longer there. And it has a lot to do with designers then, because of the process, become so angry that they almost create something just that's like bad design it's like revenge architecture in a way. I think more in terms of like oversight, when you think about like overseeing the police department or anything like that, is that design as kind of an oversight role and saying, are we ruining, because we don't realize we're ruining our neighborhoods for 10 years 20 years from now in things that we're doing today, but we can't, it's hard to discuss that. It's very abstract, going back to that point. Any thought on that?
I think that's why I'm so fascinated by this streets master plan. It's one of the first efforts to create an iterative process for more holistic thinking on what we need to do. And I think there could theoretically be other areas that need something like that. Because to your point, it really is just one-off, and based off of how community boards are acting, or how the overlapping nature of elected officials in the city. And you need to take a little bit of that politics out of it and have some real conversations about good design in many different facets of our public space.
Well, that's just a wonderful way of closing things out. That was beautiful. And you tie us back to all of the resources that I was writing down. And I don't know if you're able to share the presentation with us that I could share with the class. That would be amazing, because you have some wonderful resources. I also refer to some of what you're talking in your lectures, that I recommend everybody see the film Motherless Brooklyn, which is a lovely story about Robert Moses, and with a whole bunch of other things going on. Somebody who loves the neighborhood, Ed Norton. I really thank you so much. It's just been such a wonderful way to kick off our week looking at public spaces. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you, Jacob. Our best to you and to Brad and the future of New York. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Bye-bye.
Right.
Thanks. So guys, we're going to take lunch. And let me just